أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
In this session, we are going to focus on the concept of mediation analysis, the issues, and some strong suggestions on how to perform mediation analysis. Now, indirect or mediated effects constitute a type of relationship between constructs that often occurs in social sciences research. Although the methods for mediation have become more sophisticated, researchers still continue to use outdated methods, which can lead to wrong results. Now, researchers focus on currently majority of the research are only focusing on direct relationships, simple relationships between independent and dependent variable. This can heavily bias the interpretation of results, when a variable has no direct effect, but its effect is mediated by another variable. And this is the reason that mediation models have become almost mandatory in contemporary literature and research endeavors. Now, before going into detail, let's understand the concept of mediation. To understand the relevance of testing mediating effects, it is necessary to understand what mediating effects are. The core of mediation analysis is that it assumes a sequence of relationship in which an antecedent or your independent variable affects a mediating variable, which then affects the dependent variable. So there is a sequence of relationship. X influences Y, Y influences Z. So your Y is your mediating variable. And what it does is, mediation is one way that a researcher can explain the process or mechanism by which one variable affects another. So what mediation does is, it helps explain how one variable affects another variable. Now there are different effects that we study when we are doing mediation. There is this effect, the total effect. Total effect refers to the effect of independent variable on the dependent variable without the presence of mediating variable, and it is represented by C, which is figure 1a, this one. Your independent variable affecting the dependent variable, and this path here is represented by C without any mediator present. However, when we include the mediator within the equation, the path from independent variable to mediator is referred to as A, the path from mediator to dependent is referred to as B, and the path from independent to dependent, which was previously C, is now changed to C complement. So your direct effect, it refers to the effect of independent variable on the dependent variable in the presence of the mediating variable, and now it is C complement. And your indirect effect, which is the effect of IV on dV through your mediator variable M. So these are three effects that one should know when one is conducting mediation. Now, how many hypotheses one should propose when testing mediation? Now, there are two approaches that one can use. One is segmentation approach and other is transmittal approach. In segmentation approach, you can propose three hypotheses. The effect of X on M, that is your path A, the effect of M on Y, that is your path B, and then your indirect effect. You see, there is no direct effect. There is no hypothesis on the path C or a C complement, and we'll be discussing that later as well. It's not that you cannot propose the hypothesis, but we'll be looking at that in coming slides. So there is your mediation hypothesis or mediation effect. M mediates the relationship between X and Y, or X has an indirect effect on Y through M. And then there is transmittal approach, in which we neglect the first and second hypothesis and we are just proposing our mediation effect or mediation hypothesis. Advanced procedure for mediation analysis in PLS. Now in PLS, what we have referred to as, we first test the indirect effect. And what is your indirect effect? It is the multiplication of path A with path B. And in formula, we can express it as the difference between total effect and your direct effect. And we refer to this in our figure 1. So your indirect effect is total effect, that is C without the mediator, minus direct effect C complement in presence of mediator. So your direct effect is impact of IV on dV in presence of the mediator, depicted by a C complement or denoted by a C complement. Now, mediation analysis in PLS. Now here are the steps that we can take, and we'll be looking at this in detail. Here is the decision tree. Now you need to first assess the significance of indirect effect. Rather than going for the impact of IV on DV, what we do is with PLS we look into the significance of indirect effect. Now if the effect is significant, the indirect effect is significant, you go for assessing the effect or the direct effect, C complement. Now if the direct effect is insignificant, that is there is no impact of IV on DV in presence of the mediator, this is full mediation. But what if the direct effect is significant? This is partial mediation, and now you need to assess the sign of A into B into C, and if the sign is positive you go for complementary mediation, and if the sign is negative you go for competitive mediation. Otherwise, if the indirect effect is not significant, then assess the significance of the direct effect, that is C complement. The direct effect is significant, there is no mediation, or the effect is direct only. The direct effect is significant, obviously there is no mediation but direct effect. But if the direct effect is insignificant, there is no effect, there is no mediation. So this is how you can use PLS for understanding the mediation process, and you start with testing the indirect effect. Now what are the steps in detail? You first understand the significance of indirect effect, and in the first step you look into the indirect effect is tested for significance. Obviously PLS results give you the specific indirect effects that you can just go on and see the p-value and see if the specific indirect effects are significant. And you do not apply the Sobel test. The reason being that Sobel test assumes normality, but in case of PLS you cannot test or assume the normality for the indirect path. Alternatively, researchers should apply bootstrap routines to test the significance of the indirect effect A into B. The bootstrapping procedure is a non-parametric inferential technique that randomly draws several subsamples based on your sample with replacement from the original data set. Now, bootstrapping a data sample of an indirect effect is necessary to obtain information about the population distribution, or you cannot test the significance if you do not do bootstrapping. And normally the recommended size is 5,000 subsamples. Now step 2, determine the type of effect and or mediation that we earlier discussed. Now this involves defining the type of effect or the mediation. A mediation or mediating effect always exists when the indirect effect is A or B, A into B in step 1 is significant. So there will always be a mediating effect if your indirect path is significant. However, the current mediation literature discusses two types of mediation, full or partial mediation. Now partial mediation occurs, or partial mediation can be divided again into two approaches, complementary and competitive. Now what is full mediation? A full mediation is indicated in the case where their direct effect, that is the effect of IV on DV in presence of mediator, it actually becomes insignificant. And now we are saying that the total effect of IV on DV is passing through the mediator, and this is full mediation. Now it also means that Y or condition Y completely absorbs the positive or negative effect of X. In this way it can completely pass the effect through the mediating variable, which is the other variable in our study. It is important to consider the sample size in mediation. The smaller the sample, the more likely the mediation when present is to be labeled full as opposed to partial mediation. Now you need to have adequate sample size when doing mediation analysis. Now partial mediation, when you have got an indirect effect or your effect A into B is significant and your direct effect is also significant, this is referred to as partial mediation. And there are two types of mediation or partial mediation: complementary partial mediation. In a complementary partial mediation, the direct effect C and the indirect effect A into B point in the same positive or negative direction. So your C will be positive and your A into B will be positive, or your C will be negative and your A into B will be negative. This is complementary partial mediation. However, or it is called positive confounding or consistent model. However, there could be competitive partial mediation, in which the direct effect might be negative and your indirect effect might be positive. Obviously, PLS gives you these results in the form of beta coefficient, and you can see the sign with the beta coefficient to understand whether it is competitive or complementary partial mediation. Moving on. Previous researchers only focused on complementary mediation. In the competitive partial mediation hypothesis, it is assumed that the intermediate variable will reduce the magnitude of relationship between the independent and dependent variable. However, it is possible that the intermediate variable could increase the magnitude of the relationship between the independent and dependent variable. It's not just that with the inclusion of variable or with the inclusion of mediating variable, the impact of IV on DV gets reduced. There are times when the impact of IV on DV in presence of the mediator actually increases. And competitive partial mediation often have been called negative confounding or inconsistent model. Now, only the direct effect. If the indirect effect A into B is not significant, that is, your indirect effect is not significant, whereas the direct path, that is C, in the mediator or the mediator variable has no effect, this indicates that the direct non-mediating effect is present. So your specific indirect effect is insignificant, but your direct effect C is significant. So your mediator has no impact, and this indicates that a direct non-mediating effect is present. In this case, the study was perhaps searching for wrong mediation relationship. You should not stop here, and you should look for other variables that could mediate the relationship between an IV and DV. However, it is possible that an unrecognized mediation relationship still exists, and another mediation variable is present that mediates the relationship between X and Y. Thus, a researcher should rethink the model on theoretical basis, and if the expected mediation relationship cannot be found, so you look for other variables that could mediate the relationship between IV and DV in case your specific indirect effect is insignificant. No effect. So there is no effect if neither the indirect effect, that is A into B, nor the direct effect is significant. So both the relationships are insignificant. The specific indirect effect is insignificant and the direct effect is insignificant. So there is no effect. The total effect can still be significant. First of all, in this case, the researcher should determine whether the sample size has enough power to show the effect. Now, you should not just jump to conclusion. You should look for your sample size as well. Now, putting the last cases together, or the last two cases together, the indirect effect A into B is not significant, and the direct path C is or is not frequently indicates a problematic or flawed theoretical framework. So if your indirect effect or your mediating effect is not significant, this means that you need to go back on the drawing board and look for other variables that could mediate the relationship. In this case, the researcher should thoroughly examine the hypothesized model and go back to the drawing board and look for other variables that could help explain the relationships. Now, contemporary literature on mediation advocates that complete, also called full and partial mediation concepts have little value and should be abandoned. We should not use the terms complete and full mediation in our analysis. Now, what's the reason for this? Full mediation implies that a researcher has completely explained the process by which X influences Y, and no additional research is needed to search for further mediators. Obviously, there could be maybe tens of other mediators that could obviously explain the impact of IV on DV. So you cannot just say that, okay, this is complete or full mediation. The reality is that to claim full mediation, one would have to confidently measure all possible mediators and suppressors without error, and obviously this is not possible. So we should not complain or claim full or complete mediation. Moreover, scholars have recently advocated that claiming a complete mediation would likely to discourage other researchers from identifying other theoretically driven mediators. Researchers should avoid using these terms. Now, these are the few references that you can look into when studying mediation and that have been used for this particular tutorial.
A number of times I've been asked, how do we search for mediators for our model? A mediator is a variable that intervenes in a relationship, and it can help you explain how a variable, let's say X, influences the variable Y. So the mediator will help you explain the mechanism of impact of X on Y. So what happens is you add, let's say, a mediator 1, maybe another mediator 2. Now this mediator here, M1, M2, or these two mediators will help you explain how X influences Y. Now, why do we include mediators in our models? Because it can add to complexity in our model. It can make our model more complex. In order to further understand what is a mediator, the concept of mediation, and the terminologies linked with mediation, a detailed video is added to the description. The objective of this session is to understand how do we search for mediating variables to make our models more complex. And this is one of the gaps in research. When you read your papers that have mediators, one of the gap is that they are finding or explaining new mechanisms of impact, that is how X could influence Y. Now, in order to explain or find new mechanism, you need to have new mediators. How do we get new mediators? Now, there are multiple ways to get mediators. And as I said, this is mentioned as a strong gap in the introduction of a research paper or thesis. How? Let's have a look. Now, this is a research study. And if we look here, let me find. Nevertheless, the role of all these four variables on the relationship between customer perceptions of CSR and loyalty has not been explored in an integrated way so far. So, this research here is based on mediation. The gap primarily revolves around mediation. Another paper, let's have a look here. The mediating role of team outcomes, and let's search how the gaps are explained. Despite teamwork being an important element contributing to the positive group and organizational outcome or outcomes, its mediating role in the CSR-OP relationship has not been sufficiently explained. So mediation can serve as a strong gap in your research, and it can help you explain. And why it's a gap? Because what it does is it helps explain the impact of IV on DV. It explains the mechanism, and you mentioned this in your contributions as well. Just let me briefly look into it. Keeping in view the mentioned rationales, this study makes several contributions. First, this study substantiates the CSR-OP relationship. Furthermore, although there are extensive studies on CSR impact on individual outcomes, a little is known about team outcomes. This study shifts the CSR literature predominant focus on individual outcomes, and now it focuses on team outcomes. This makes provision for one of the main empirical and theoretical contributions of the present study. This study is one of the first to propose a model where team outcomes mediate the relationship. Now, this is a very strong contribution of this study. And similarly, you can find it in other studies as well. Now, how do you search for mediation or mediating variable, or rather variables? An easier way is to look into the limitations and future research directions. And they would have recommended some mediators. Now here, this study focused on 4 team outcomes. Future studies could have, or rather take into consideration, other team outcomes as well. Similarly, in this study, you can go into limitations and future research directions, and they would have proposed some new mediators. Some studies may not have proposed some mediators, but obviously you will then search for other studies. So if a relationship between an independent and dependent variable is studied with one or two mediators, you can look into those research studies and identify any other mediators that they have identified. Now look at this one here. Future studies could ascertain the mediating role of other variables on the linkage between CSR and loyalty that may include positive word of mouth, so they are suggesting new mediators. Now, an important point is never take all your mediators from one research study. The reason being that the authors may already be working on these mediators, or someone else around the world may take these mediators. So obviously try to search for mediators from multiple studies. Now here, an important question could be that let's say there is only one study that has assessed the impact of, let's say, social responsibility on loyalty, and they have recommended certain mediators. Now, how do you find new mediators? Let's look into that. For example, let's say I've got this variable here, knowledge-oriented leadership. And I found a study that assessed its impact on organizational performance. Now, there has only been one single study that assessed the impact of knowledge-oriented leadership on organizational performance. And they have recommended maybe, let's say, knowledge management processes as new mediator. Now, how do I search for some other mediators? Now, since there has only been one study linking KOL with QOAP, maybe there are other studies that have assessed the role of KOL on different organizational outcomes, or maybe individual level outcomes, maybe on employee performance, maybe employee behaviors or attitudes like self-efficacy or something else. Now try to search for those studies and see what they have recommended. Now they would have recommended maybe some variables that may be influenced by knowledge-oriented leadership. So find out the variables that they have recommended that can be used in future study to assess the impact of knowledge-oriented leadership. Let's say they have recommended that future research studies may look into the impact of knowledge-oriented leadership on trust. Maybe, let's say, knowledge sabotage behavior. Maybe knowledge worker loyalty. Now, these are not recommended as mediators between QOL and OP, but QOL may influence these variables as recommended in one research. Now, the next step is whether they can be mediators or not. Now, then you will have to find evidence whether trust can influence OP, whether knowledge sabotage behavior can influence OP, whether knowledge worker loyalty influence OP. Is there any evidence in existing literature? Now, if there is evidence and you already have a recommendation for the influence of QOL on these variables, plus just the recommendation is not enough, you will have to find out whether QOL can influence these variables or not. And then, since trust can be influenced by QOL and trust can influence OP, these variables can serve as mediators. Now you search for different research on QOL and find out what they have recommended for future research. So you will have a list of variables 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 that have been recommended in, let's say, 3 to 4 research studies. Now then look into further research as to whether these variables can influence this variable or not. If so, they can serve as mediators. Now let's say you've been searching and you could not find any future research direction in the existing literature on QOL that has recommended the impact of QOL on any variable. Now again, you can look into the other variable, the dependent variable, let's say OP. So I've been searching on OP, the latest research on OP, and maybe let's say researchers have recommended that, okay, so competitive advantage should be linked to OP. Let's say internal marketing shall be linked to OP. Let's say different team outcomes shall be linked to OP. Let's say life satisfaction may be linked to OP. Now it has been suggested in existing research that these variables may influence OP. So can these variables be affected by KOL? Is there any evidence that KOL may affect these? Now a question might be in your mind that there is no research on KOL. How will I know whether KOL can influence this? Now there are two ways to find out. Number one, since KOL is a type of leadership, can leadership influence these outcomes? If so, yes, KOL will also influence. Secondly, search for theory that may link different leadership styles with these variables. Or in the last session, I guess I mentioned something about this as well. It was last or some earlier session. I'll share the video. Search or identify the conceptualization of this variable. Search and identify the conceptualization of these variables and see whether based on these conceptualization you can link these variables or not. Now the link for that video will be shared. Now this is how you can look into and find out whether or not a particular mediator can be linked between the two variables or not. And you can search for new mediators for your study rather than just looking into recommendations from existing research. Or you can find out new variables that could help you explain the relationship between the two variables. Furthermore, try to read on these variables. The more you read, the more you will find out as to how these variables operate within an organization. And then you can recommend new mediators that can help explain the relationship between these variables and can help you make a more complex model for your research study. In summary, the first step, look for future research directions. Second, see the variables that have been recommended in existing research that are being influenced by the IV in your study. If you cannot find any, then look for another variable. Let's say those variables that have been recommended to influence your DV, that is your OP in this example. Number 4, read about these variables and you will get to know some other variables that could be influenced by this and may influence this, and then you can have new original mediators in your study. Now these are simple ways to identify new mediators. Again, there could be other ways. Read theory. What's the underlying theory for these variables? Let's say in this case, two theories are important: knowledge-based view and resource-based view. Now read about these theories. Read about latest research on these theories and see what existing research has recommended as to what variables could be utilized to further explain these theories in organizational context, and can those variables serve as mediators between these two concepts. Again, if a variable is being affected by this variable and then it can influence this variable, yes, it can serve as a mediator. Again, you will use theory to explain these relationships.
Moving on, now we are going to look into mediation, a simple mediation model with one mediator. Now let's move this one up just to make it easier to understand. Move it this one here. Let's move this one here. Now what I need to do is, in order to make this one that is your organizational commitment a mediator, I need to link it with my exogenous collaborative culture variable. Now look at this, the paths are complete. This is your direct effect and this is your indirect effect. How do we test this model? Now before mediation or any structural model assessment, you will have to assess the measurement model. So I'm assuming that we have already tested the reliability and validity of these constructs. And now we are going for structural model assessment. So how to do this? Let's say calculate, bootstrapping. Now let's say I'm going to use one tail now because I know the direction of relationships. And path, standardized default, data is fine. For now, 5000 is fine. Let's start. Now here are our results. Now all paths are significant. So what's the procedure? Let's look at the procedure. the first step, is P1 into P2 significant? Now P1 here is this relationship here, P2 is this relationship here. So P1 multiplied by P2 is your indirect effect, and this means whether or not there is mediation. So how do we check for mediation? Let's go to report and let's go to specific indirect effects. So CC, OC, OP. Now you've got only one indirect effect here, from CC to OC, OC to OP. This is just one indirect effect. So step 1, is P1, P2 significant? Have a look here. Is it significant? Yes, it is significant. Why is it significant? Because the p-value is less than 0.05. Look at the beta, 0.270. How do you get this value, 0.270? If you multiply 0.616 by 0.438. So 0.616, 0.616 multiplied by 0.438 is equal to 0.2698. When rounded off is 0.270. Is the indirect effect significant? Yes, it is significant. And this means that the impact of CC on OP is through this other variable, that is organizational commitment. So what happens is CC influences OC and OC influences OP. Now the next step, once we see that yes, there is indirect effect, so you will come here. Is P3 significant? Where is P3? This here is P3. This is your direct effect. Why am I saying this is direct effect? Because you already have a mediator in the model. Is this significant? Yes, it is significant. So some of the impact of CC on OP is passing through this path here, whereas some of the impact is passing through this path here. So both the path, the indirect path and the direct path, both are significant. Look at this. P3 significant? Yes, P3 is significant. Well, if P3 wasn't significant, let's consider this is not significant. So if this is not significant, this means that no impact of CC on OP is passing through this path. And when no impact is passing through this path and your indirect effect is significant, this means that the whole impact of CC on OP is passing through this particular path. That is, there is full mediation. But in this case, our P3, that is direct effect, is significant. So if it is significant, then it is partial mediation. Look at this. Even if it is P3 is significant, you will go down this route. And if you go down this route, you've got two options, complementary and competitive, but both are partial mediation. What is partial mediation? Some of the impact of CC on OP is passing through this path here, and some of the impact is passing through this indirect path from CC to OC to OP. That is the impact of CC on OP through OC. Now that both paths are significant, your indirect effect and your direct effect. Now, is it complementary mediation or competitive mediation? Now, if you multiply P1 with P2, P3, P1, P2, P3, is the sign negative for the path coefficient that you get out of it? No, it is positive. So this is complementary mediation. Now, if any one of them would have been negative, this would have been competitive mediation here. Now, in this case, it is complementary partial mediation. So this is how you can use SmartPLS4 to assess basic mediation model.